Hello, this Sunday, in light of the upcoming 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, we're going to begin a short 3-week discussion on the life and teachings of Martin Luther. Today I want us to consider this brief sketch of Luther's background and beginnings. One of the first things to note is that Martin Luther, unlike all of the other dominant personalities of the Reformation, was a man firmly fixed in the world of late medieval Europe. In most centuries leading up to the Reformation, Europe had undergone some significant changes. These changes had a profound effect on how many came to see their world. One significant event that took place largely in the 14th century was the pandemic known as the Black Plague. The plague that swept Europe accounted for approximately 30 million deaths in Europe alone, and as many as 200 million worldwide. Along with the obvious demographic changes that would result from this, one should also note some deep psychological effects from the Black Death. Having no knowledge of how diseases are transmitted, the plague would have seemed like an arbitrary judgment of God. This also deepened within the mind of most Europeans a grave sense of their own sin and depravity. As we begin to approach the time of the Reformation, we also see growth in urban areas. This resulted in economic changes where capital became more centralized, and it also had the effect of empowering local and provincial leaders, as well as promoting political competition among them. Another important factor of late medieval Europe was a weakening in papal influence. As political leaders gained power, they would often use their power to influence church leaders. Along with political influence, the leadership within the church grew more and more corrupt. This eventually led to schisms within the Roman Church. At one time, there were actually 2 popes claiming the seat of St. Peter. In order to resolve these problems, we begin to see something called the conciliar movement. Instead of looking to a pope to solve these problems, something hard to do when you have more than one of them, more and more emphasis began to fall on the role of church councils to solve disputes. The conciliar movement was effective, but it was also short-lived. It is important in that it sets a precedent that Luther and the early reformers hoped to utilize within the church to bring about needed reforms. In terms of changes in philosophy or theology, during the 14th century there was a rejection of the realism of Thomas Aquinas for what is sometimes called nominalism, the nominalism of Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. The result of this was that reason no longer served as a sound approach to knowing God. Rather, God came to be seen as unknowable in himself, and divine will and power became the dominant way of describing God's relation to the world and to our salvation. During this time we also begin to see voices of protest who come to be recognized as the precursors of the Reformation. John Wycliffe protested against the pomp and privilege of the clergy and believed that the Bible needed to be translated into the vernacular. Jan Hus shared many of Wycliffe's views and also protested against the church's practice of selling indulgences. Both of these men were declared to be heretics by the Council of Constance in 1415. There at Constance, Huss was burned at the stake, while Wycliffe, who had died of a stroke in 1384, had his body exhumed and burned in 1428. His ashes were cast into the river Swift. From this, his followers would come to say that his presence and influence went to the 4 corners of the world. Another important feature of pre-Reformation Europe was the rise in what is called Renaissance humanism. Not to be confused with modern-day secular humanism, this movement described the growing popularity in the study of the scriptures, early church fathers, and other ancient literature. This movement provided the exegetical tools for the reformers. It also had the effect of highlighting greater disparity between official church doctrine and the plain teachings of Scripture. Finally, European Christendom was facing an external threat from the Ottoman Empire. This Islamic empire had begun extending its reach into Europe, even threatening the very gates of Vienna. In In light of a number of these changes, Rome wanted to put forward a unified and strong front. One way to do this was seen in a significant construction project underway in Rome. Plans for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica began as early as the end of the 1400s, and construction lasted over a century. The enormous cost of this project was one of the principal reasons for the sale of indulgences throughout Europe as Luther came onto the scene. So let's talk about Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born on November 10th, 1483 in Eisleben, Saxony, in what was then known as the Holy Roman Empire. Martin Luther was named after St. Martin of Tours by his parents Hans and Margarita Luther. Hans became a successful copper smelter, and by 1491 the Luthers were one of the most respected families in Mansfield, a city they had moved to in 1484. Martin's mother, Margarita, came from a small but very well-off family. She was known to be a harsh disciplinarian. Luther once recalled that, "For the sake of stealing a nut, my mother once beat me until blood flowed." Hans also ruled his son with an iron fist. Martin later recalled, "My father once whipped me so hard I ran away. I hated him until he finally managed to win me back." Hans had high hopes for his first son, and had his heart set on Martin becoming a lawyer, which would enable the Luthers to climb even higher up on the social ladder. Young Martin followed his father's wishes without protest. He was sent to the best schools in the area, and then eventually to the university at Erfurt. The event which radically changed the course of Luther's life took place near Stotterheim on July 2nd, 1505. Luther had recently completed his master's degree and started his law studies at the University of Erfurt. He was on his way back to Erfurt after having visited his parents when he was caught in a terrible thunderstorm. A few hours outside of Erfurt, lightning struck near him, and he was thrown to the ground by the air pressure it created. At this moment he cried out to St. Anne, "I will become a monk." Luther commented on this event later. It is assumed that he had played with the idea of becoming a monk even before the storm hit. To his father's disgust and anger, Luther honored his solemn promise, and he had one last party with university friends on July 16th, and the next day he entered the Black Monastery in Erfurt to become a monk. Life in the monastery was not easy, and for Luther it may have been harder than his peers. Luther was tormented by his conscience, aware of his sin, and he always questioned, how could a righteous God forgive a sinner such as me? His life in the monastery was characterized by extreme asceticism, prayers and fasts, and sleep deprivation, cold whipping himself. He was constantly found at confession, much to the consternation of those who had to listen to his confession. Luther once said, "If ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, I was that monk." As he was in the abbot, during his time in the abbot, he visited Rome. The abbot Staupitz sent Luther on a pilgrimage to Rome. There, Luther visited the holiest places. He crawled up Pilate's staircase. Luther observed priests and bishops acting immorally and abusing their power. Luther would say, "I went with onions and I returned with garlic." In other words, he was worse off on his way home than when he had started out. After this, Staupitz sent Luther to Wittenberg as a theology professor. Here's where Luther had his breakthrough. Sometime during his Psalms lecture, between the years 1518 and 1521, Luther came to understand the righteousness of God in a new and earth-shattering way. In reading Romans 17, Luther understood the gospel to be the revelation of God's righteousness, or the justice of God. But to Luther, the justice of God was unbearable. It revealed a harsh, judgmental God, the God who was always angry at sin. Yet somehow the gospel linked God's righteousness to the good news of salvation. Justice, or God's righteousness, Luther came to understand, does not refer primarily here in Paul's letter to the Romans as punishment for sinners. Righteousness is given to those who live by faith. From here the scales fell from his eyes. He understood that justification before God was a free gift of God's grace to sinners. Righteousness was the righteousness of Christ imputed to him by God. God justifies humans by their faith in Jesus Christ. Luther would go on to say, "Here I felt as if I were entirely born again and had entered paradise itself through the gates that had been flung open. The whole of Scripture gained a new meaning, and from that point on the phrase, the justice of God, no longer filled me with dread or filled me with hatred, but rather became unspeakably sweet by virtue of a great love." Well, we're going to stop here for this Sunday in our introduction to Luther. If you have time before this Sunday, I'd like you to get a copy of Luther's Small Catechism and read the first part of the first section. It's the section dealing with the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. If you don't have a copy of Luther's Small Catechism, you can find it online at bookofconcord.org, and just go to the left-hand side column and you can click on the link that takes you directly to the Small Catechism. Well, that's all we have for today, and I look forward to our discussion on Sunday. We'll talk to you soon, and goodbye.